previous videos on tension. So that's number one. And now it's coming in. And what that's doing is that's putting the disc Hello everybody and welcome back to the Quilters Apothecary. Today is a wonderful learning day. So we've received a lot of letters. So there's a lot of new surface quilters out there that are asking questions about tension. Now we have a couple of incredible basic tension tutorials and videos out on YouTube and on Patreon. But one thing we've never done, and a lot of people are asking, is could you do a deep dive? Not just talk to us about how to get great tension and how to get great tension fast, which we're going to cover in this particular tutorial, but also going to the machine with all different types of thread and walking through the process of how I spend an hour or two, even though that's not how long, we'll make sure we cut this well, getting good tension with all the different threads. Now the one thing we always want to remember is that not every thread is perfect for every machine. So you have to figure that out with your machine. So if you want to figure out what threads work great with your machine, this is the perfect video for you. But the one thing we're going to do right now is we're going to start from the top and work our way all the way down to the bottom. And for me, good tension starts with making sure you are running your bobbin winder correctly. So that's where we're going to start on this video, and then we're going to talk about what threads I like and what threads I use. And by the way, when I talk about those things, I am referring to not just on the machines that I have. I have a couple different brands of machines, but there are the threads that I take to shows and I take to friends' houses and studios, and I run on all the different machines. I run a lot of different threads, and what I'm familiar with and I'm very good about tension with is obviously our handy quilters, our Anovas, the APQS, the Gamel, the Bernina. I've utilized the Bernina a lot, Nolting, you know, most of the A1, most of the surface quilting machines, and of course my new Juki that I am in love with. So there we go. So that's where this one's heading. So first, let's head over to the bobbin winder and let's talk a little bit about the bobbin winder, because that is where good tension starts. I have learned, and as some of you have heard me say over and over again, 95% of tension issues are because of your bobbin and your bobbin case. So if that's where it starts, then we want to talk about why that is and go to our bobbin winder and start there. The other thing I want to make sure that we recognize is that your bobbin case, you want to make sure is in good round, and we're going to talk a little bit about this wonderful tool that we produce for L-size bobbin cases and M-size bobbin cases. It's called a bobbin case dewarper, and we actually utilize this to make sure that when we drop those bobbin cases on the floor, or they hit or they take hits, that we can re-round them, because that's where a lot of tension issues come, is that people will reach under and grab their bobbin case, and what will happen is it will hit the floor because they don't have a good hold on it. I know I still do that occasionally. My bobbin case will catch on some thread and it'll drop on the floor. And even if you have light carpeting, those bobbin cases, they're very good, but they do warp after one or two hits, and it just has to hit just right, even at one time, to do a warp. And so I always like to re-round them. So I'm going to actually show that real quick, and then we'll head over to the bobbin winder. Okay, so here's where we're going to start. We have our bobbin case. And of course this is for my Innova machine, but it would work the same no matter what machine I had. The one thing I want to do is to quickly go over we've got our 2 screws. Now I have a pretty intensive video out talking about um, bobbin case, management and maintenance. And we have the 2 screws. The one thing that we want to remember for my new folks is we never adjust this small one. The small one is actually what holds our little tension finger here to the bobbin case. And the big screw is actually what we utilize to set our tension on our bobbin case. And of course, most bobbin cases have our little gingerbread guy or some sort of spring for our bobbin. And of course, the middle peg hole. And of course, this is our bobbin case dewarper. So when we use this, and I use this about once a week on all my machines on Sunday, I just go around and I actually go ahead, put this in. Now, it was just done, so it goes on and in perfectly. And this is machined perfectly to an M-size bobbin, and I want to re-round it. Now, what will happen sometimes is that I will go and I will make the adjustment by putting this on, and it'll be hard to get on. And what that tells me is that my bobbin case has hit the floor a few times and I have warped my bobbin case. And one of the symptoms that will happen when I'm quilting is that if this is warped a little bit, when I put in my bobbin, what'll happen is with a warped bobbin case, it'll rub against the edges as it turns because one of the sides of this is caved in a little bit. It's warped. And so you'll get intermittently bad tension. So I always want to make sure to de-warp my bobbin case once a week. Of course, this is M size. This works for all the M sizes, and we also have the L size for anybody that has the L size bobbin cases. We do not have them for any of the home machines or the domestic machines. So that is step number 1. What I want to do now is to take a few minutes and we're going to talk about our bobbin case. Now, this particular case is for our handy quilters. All the machine cases are very similar. The only difference typically is whether or not they're going to be an L or an M size bobbin. I know on the Innova though, they have 2 different types of bobbin case. One was their old style bobbin case for their hook assembly, and then their new hook assembly, which takes a definite specific bobbin case. So let's just go to the basics of a bobbin case. So here obviously is a bobbin case, and this is the case you would put your bobbin into before you put it into your hook assembly. And we'll go to your machine and we'll look at the hook assembly and how to oil your machine shortly. But right now, what we want to talk about are the different parts of your bobbin case. So let's start with your trigger. So on this particular trigger, this opens. The one thing to know is this: the only time this little latch ever comes up like this is when you're taking the bobbin case out of the race. And the race is what we call the hook assembly, where you snap your bobbin case into. So that's the only time you pull this. You never open this up when you put your bobbin case in. That's not how you do it. You actually take the bobbin case with this closed, put it into the race, and then you're going to snap it into place. Next, what I'd like to show you on the bobbin case is the tension finger. This is your tension finger. And what I want to do is to show you on the tension finger, and the thread is going to come around and go under that. Let me show you that real quick, and then we'll go back to that tension finger. So I would put my bobbin case, put the bobbin in the bobbin case. I'm going to slide the thread right under the little finger, and so that is how you would put your bobbin into your bobbin case. Okay, so just so you know, the thread always goes underneath that little finger. So I know that this is pretty basic for most people, but let's get into some specifics. So now on this tension finger, you're going to have 2 screws. And pretty typically you're going to have the big screw. The big screw is closest to the end of the finger where the thread comes out. That big screw is what you adjust your tension on your bobbin case with. And then of course you have your small screw here, and that is simply the screw which holds your tension finger in place. That's what keeps it on the bobbin case. So again, this one should be nice and snug all the time. This is something you don't adjust. What you're actually going to be using to adjust your tension is the big screw that's out toward the edge. And with the screw, when you're looking at it, it's always going to be lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. And that's how that works when you're loosening and you're tightening it. Okay, now on the inside of most bobbin cases, not all bobbin cases, but most bobbin cases on the inside are going to have some sort of tension spring. Now, most of mine have what I call the gingerbread man, and you'll see when I take that out of there, you can kind of see here's the head of the gingerbread man, and then we have the two arms coming up the side. Now, this bobbin case actually is pretty dirty, so I want to take it apart and clean it. And what I'm doing right now is something that I'm going to do about, every 3 months. Now, I'm running a nice polyester thread all the time in my bobbin. When I used to run cotton, I would do this about once a month. But since I only run the poly in my bobbin, I'm only have to do this about once every 3 months to keep my bobbin case in good shape. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my little screwdriver and I'm going to pop it out. Now there are two little, let me get this out of here first. Now, I want you to see, now you can see the gingerbread. Here's his head, and here's his two arms coming up in the side. And what I also want you to see on this is you can see the little tab here, and then over here down the side you can see the tab on this side. And in your bobbin case you're actually going to have slots. So I have a matching slot where that tab is going to go in there, and then I have one down here. Now, one thing that I know is when I take this out to clean it, I always want to make sure to kind of, just in my head, kind of make sure that I have it right. These can only go in the bobbin case one way. And this one's pretty easy because the tab is up here and then down here. And so the slots in my bobbin case, it's pretty obvious how that goes. Now, one of the things that I like to do is about once every, I don't know, few months, 2, 3 months, however you want to do yours. I like to go ahead and in my spa treatment and clean out my bobbin case. I'm going to take this out, and I would go ahead, I would use a nice soft cloth because it does build up like a thread puke, oil residue, all sorts of stuff in here. Now this one's not so bad. This is pretty clean. What is dirty is the inside of my bobbin case, and you can kind of see how bad that's gotten. I'm ashamed to say I've let that get that bad. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a Q-tip, and I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to simply get all of the residue out of the inside of that bobbin case. And there's lots of thread puke, oil residue, batting lint, all sorts of stuff in there. So I'm going to go ahead, get that out of there. And then what I like to do is I like to go ahead and I like to get my oil that I oil my machine with, same oil, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drop a drop or two of oil right in that bobbin case, and I'm going to use my Q-tip again, and I'm simply going to go in there and spread that oil around. Now, it's just putting a really thin layer. This isn't going to transfer to my thread, but what it does is it keeps my bobbin case nice and clean, and it also keeps it, what I call it, seasoned. It reminds me of what we do to an iron skillet. It just kind of keeps it nice and clean and seasoned, and it also helps that bobbin case spin freely, I feel. Okay. So now I've done that. It's nice and clean. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to replace this in there. But before I do that, let me show you on the tensioner for the bobbin case. This little finger right here. When I do my maintenance on my bobbin case, what I like to do is I like to take a flower head pin, a nice really thin one. I wouldn't use like a corsage pin. I'd use a nice thin one. Some people use a business card. I find I'm pretty comfortable doing this. I've never heard a bobbin case, and I wouldn't go in here and scrape it back and forth. Now look at that. You can kind of see some of the lint. That little bit of lint, and I'm not done yet, that comes off can change your tension and give you tension issues. Just that little pinhead of lint right there. So I'm going to go ahead, put that under. I'm going to bring it forward. I'm going to go around that finger because there's a little finger right there. And then I'm just going to bring it down and under there because lint will like to gather right there, especially if you're using cotton thread in your bobbin. I'm going to do it a second time. Put that right there, get that out of there, and I can see that there is some lint. So now I've got that off of there, and now I have cleaned out the finger of my tensioner on my bobbin case. And again, now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put my gingerbread man back into my bobbin case. So I'm going to line up those holes. I'm going to get that in there. I always have my little screwdriver handy because I'm going to need that. And let me throw on my glasses so I can actually see what I'm doing here. And I'm simply going to go in, make that a little more visible, and I'm going to line up my little slots. And I want to make sure that those guys pop in place. That popped in, that popped in. Now, here's the key. The one thing you must remember is a lot of times it will look like it went in, but it didn't go in. And what'll happen is that'll mess with your tension and you'll never get good tension. You got to make sure when you put that gingerbread man in that you make sure that it goes into those slots. So that tab went into that slot and the other tab went into the correct slot over here. And I want to double check. And then what I do, the other double check is I'm going to take my bobbin. I'm going to take my bobbin. I'm going to lay it right in there. And what I want to do is I never want that little spring to go higher than the edge of the bobbin case. Now I know that some people say, yeah, they don't mind if it goes up higher like that. I don't like that because when I put my bobbin case into my race assembly or my hook assembly, what will happen is that will add a lot of tension to my bobbin case. I like it to go to about there. There's enough spring here so that I know I'm not going to get backlash because that's the whole point of that spring is so that when you come to a stop, the bobbin doesn't keep spinning and give you rat's nest. If you're getting some rat's nest when you come to a stop, that could be one of the reasons why. That little gingerbread head is not out far enough. Now, if you ever do need to adjust that, all you do is, and let me pop that out again to show you that. If you ever did want to adjust that, what I would do is you can see when it's flat, do you see how the spring is kind of made so this part sticks up? So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to bend it up a hair more, a little more, just bend it up lightly. You don't want to play with that too much. But now that's up just a little bit higher, and now you'll see the difference. I'm going to put it back in, line it up, use my screwdriver, make sure that it pops into place. Which it did. So now everything's good there. Now I'm going to drop my bobbin in. And now you can see I've got a little bit more sponginess in there. So I've got a little bit more spring in my bobbin case. It's not free floating. There's some spring going on there. And that's what I wanted. Okay, so now that's perfect. And again, it's not going up above the ledge. It's right exactly where it needs to be. Okay, so before we actually go to the bobbin winder, I want to talk a little bit about how I handle my thread with my machine. Everybody has a different method. They use different types of threads. That whole process is a little different for everybody. Since I'm showing my process, and you can then mimic it based on what type of threads you like to use. The one thing that I know for me is that I like to use a really good 40 weight thread in my bobbin. I'm not a pre-wound guy. I always wind my own bobbins. If you are a pre-wound guy, it pretty much is going to follow the same process that I'm talking about, with just a few minor adjustments. So the first thing that I want to say is normally when I am quilting my regular quilts using regular threads that aren't too thin, I am using mostly 40 weight thread. Now the thread that I typically use is a 40 weight isocord. It's put out by, who is that? That is OSB, is that correct? Amand. Which is a Bernina owned company. And in my opinion, they make the most amazing threads that have worked fantastic for me for thousands and thousands of quilts. It is a 40 weight poly, and it is actually an embroidery polyester thread, but boy, is it ever smooth. And for me, that's what I'm looking for. Usually I'm using this in my bobbin as well as my top, but sometimes I will substitute something else in the top. Now I run all sorts of thread in the top thread. So for example, metallic and visible, the glitter or sliver type threads, the ribbon threads. Cotton threads, I'll usually use the King Tut from Superior. We really like the glide thread as well. Now sometimes I'll actually use the glide thread in my bobbin. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. If I'm going to be utilizing something like, let's say, the Superior Micro Quilter, which is a 100 weight thread, that is an extremely thin thread. It's not a thread that I personally want to put in my bobbin. Again, that is my personal opinion. What I do want is a stable thread in my bobbin. When I think about bobbin thread, what I think about is it is the foundation of my quilt house, so to speak. So if you're building a house, you wouldn't build it with thin or not heavy cement. You wouldn't make your footings and you wouldn't make your foundation very light. You wouldn't use sand. So in my quilt, I wouldn't want that either. I want to use a nice stable thread. Typically for me, it's the 40 weights. For some people, they like to use the 50 weights, like the So-Fines and those sorts of things. I just find for me personally that a nice smooth embroidery weight thread of 40 weight is really lovely, whether it be the Isocord, which is my favorite, or my Glide, which I use as a secondary option. I will occasionally use my 60 weight Glide, and for some people they may choose the 60 weight bottom line from Superior. They tend to be interchangeable. I just find that for me, the 60 weight glide tends to work a little bit better for me on my machines than the bottom line works. But a lot of people run bottom line in their bobbin and it works great for them. So that's something to be aware of as well. So when I do use my 60 weight, it's because I'm going to be using something like my micro quilter. I'm not going to run 100 weight in my bobbin. I will run my 60 weight glide in my bobbin. For something like this, because in that case I find that the 40 weight, it can be a little obtrusive in the bottom when you flip it over and look at it. Not bad. I've done it before. I did it for years, and then I tried the 60 weight with the 100 weight micro quilter, and I really like that. Now when I'm running my metallics, or and that's either metallic, I tend to stick to my Superior metallic as well as my Filtech metallic. It's the same company that makes Glide for that one. Superior makes their metallic. Then I will stick to my 40 weight poly, i.e. my Isocord. When I'm using my invisible threads, and I pretty much am exclusive with the Superior monopoly. That's the one that I've found it works best for me. I use it in smoke and I use it in the clear. I'm usually going to be using my 40 weight isocord for that. But I suppose you could use, if you fall in love with the 60 weight glide or the 60 weight bottom line, you could use that for that. But I've never had an issue using the smooth threads. So back to, oh, and the cottons. So for example, the cotton that I use, and frankly one of the only cottons that I use, even though I used to use signature cotton, but now I'm pretty exclusive on the rare times that I use cotton thread for my surface quilting, because I prefer a polyester in my surface quilting. I will use the, it is the King Tut from Superior, and I think that that's an amazing cotton thread. But it's one thread that I'm not going to be using in my bobbin, and that's a personal choice. I want a smooth thread in my bobbin. Again, back to the isocord or the glide thread, the 40 weights. So typically you're always going to find my 40 weight in my bobbin no matter what I'm using in my top thread. Also, that keeps my quilting and my quilting time consistent. I don't have to mess a lot with what's going on and what's happening and why am I having issues. If I'm running pretty much an exclusive thread in my bobbin, and for new quilters I always suggest that, a nice 40 weight smooth, then I just know that if I'm having an issue, it's not about my bobbin. So there we go. There is a myth out there, and I want to make sure that everybody is aware of that if you've not heard me say it before. But a lot of people say you have to match weights of thread for your bobbin and your top thread. And that is a myth. That's not true. When I run my 40 weight bobbin, I will be running sometimes extremely thin thread or extremely thick thread in my top if I'm doing art quilts. And I have no issues whatsoever. It's all about balance and how your machine tends to maneuver. Okay, so that's a little bit of coverage about the threads that we're going to talk about today and test at the machine. Let's go over to the bobbin winder now and talk a little bit more about that. Now, let's go to the side here. There are a lot of different bobbin winders out on the market. Let me get some of this distracting shrapnel out of the way. But they're pretty much the same basic type, most of them. Now there is one bobbin out there that Innova uses, and I believe it's called the L&M bobbin winder, and we have them, and I've loved them and I've enjoyed them, and there's not really a lot of adjustment options on those. And again, they always winded the bobbin well. I did enjoy them. But on most of our bobbin winders, we have options for adjusting our bobbin winder. Now this, which is a little dirty, let me wipe a little bit of that dust off of there. This is from our Handy Quilter, so this is our Handy Quilter bobbin winder. But again, my A1 bobbin winder, my Gamma bobbin winder, they were all pretty much the same philosophy, the same types of adjustments that I'm going to be talking about here. So we're going to talk a little bit about winding a bobbin. So I'm going to take you through the process of how I wind a bobbin and also how I adjust. So I'm going to pop my thread right on my bobbin winder, and I've got my isocord in there. I figure I'll go ahead and use that one. And then what I'm going to do is we have our little arm up here. One of the things that I want you to remember and to realize is this arm always needs to be adjusted and tightened no matter which form of bobbin winder you have, so that it is directly above your cone. You don't want it back behind the cone, you don't want it in front of the cone. You want it directly above the cone. It wants to feed off nice and smooth. Now, usually there's going to be another guide. On this bobbin winder, we have a guide right here. It's a simple pigtail guide. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take that around there. And now, normally on this particular bobbin winder, the specs are that I would go behind like this, go between my disc tensioner, and then over to where I would pop my bobbin on here and wind my bobbin. Now that being said, That's a great way to do it if you so choose to do that. That is not how I do that. And where I differ is when I come to this disc tensioner. What I have found is that the threads will sometimes pop out of here, go into this little spring area, and you wind a very loose, poor bobbin that you can't use. It's very spongy. And so I have found that I get a better tension when I go in front, up and over, and around. Now I know that while I'm winding that bobbin, that thread is going to remain in that disc tensioner. And we always want to make sure that our thread is between the two discs that are here. And then of course I would go ahead and I would wind my bobbin. So let me grab a blank bobbin and then we'll go ahead and we'll wind it, and I'll talk a little bit about adjustments. But before I head over to get that bobbin, let's go ahead and discuss some of the adjustments. When I wind a bobbin, I usually will wind a bobbin between 3/4 to completely full. Now I would wind it, this bobbin has been used a little bit, so I would normally wind it a little bit more than that, but not more than halfway between 3/4 and completely full, because they can dome out here and they'll look level to the edge of the bobbin case, but what will happen is that dome will rub against the side of your bobbin case and it will give you intermittently bad tension. That's why I only fill them up 3/4 to halfway full, and that's about when I will stop. So that's extremely important when you wind them. Also, what you need to notice when you're winding a bobbin is the tension on which you wind the bobbin. Now, a lot of these bobbin winders come, when they are delivered with your long arm, they come tightly tensioned. The screw is screwed all the way tight, and what happens a lot of times, and they do that for shipment so that it doesn't get damaged and so that the knobs don't come off and that sort of thing. But what happens is a lot of times when a machine is set up, nobody readjusts this to the right place. When this is tightened so tight and you wind a bobbin, what's happening is when the thread is being fed from the spool down past the tensioner to the bobbin, if it's real tight here, what's happening is it's stretching that thread before it gets wound up on the bobbin. And so then what's happening is that you have a bobbin full of thread that's stretched thread. You don't want to sew in stretched bobbin thread when you're quilting, because what happens is anything that's stretched is always going to, the elasticity is always going to pop back in and try to find home. And so in your quilt, that's going to cause you a lot of issues. So you want to make sure that your tensioner on your bobbin winder is not too tight. And how do I check that? What I do is I grab a hold of my thread, I've wrapped it around my disc tensioner the way that I choose to do it, and what I do is I give a gentle pull. And what I want to see is that it stays in this tension disc and it feeds immediately without stretching. So as I grab this and I pull, notice how quickly that thread starts to feed and there is no stretching going on. But if I had tightened this, or it was tightened from the factory really tight and I didn't know that, I would be winding stretched thread onto my bobbin. And so that's something to be aware of if you just can't figure out what's going on with my tension as a new quilter. You're not aware of that. And even some of our seasoned quilters don't know that. So that's adjustment number one. The other thing that can happen is when thread is wound on a bobbin, what'll happen is sometimes it'll end up full on like the right side of the bobbin, but over on the left side inside the bobbin, it's not full, and so you get an uneven wind. The thread should be winding on the bobbin just like this. And with most of these bobbin winders, what you have is you have an adjustment. Okay, so the one thing we want to make sure is that we don't loosen this little little screw that's right up against here. It's not a screw, it's more like a little what are those called? Allen wrench. Holes right here. We don't want to loosen that. A lot of people make that mistake. You don't need to do that. What this knob will do as we turn it, do you see how that's going out and now it's coming in? And what that's doing is that's putting the disc and the thread in the position so that when it winds on the bobbin, it's going to wind evenly. If it's out too far, it's going to overwind on one side of the inside of the bobbin or the other. If it's in too much, it's going to repeat the same thing. And so you have to find the correct position. It has to be adjusted properly. So if you're getting a inconsistently wound bobbin, you need to know that's the reason. And so you need to make that adjustment based on how your machine works. Again, the one bobbin winder that's not going to work on is the L&M that Innova has. That one's already that's set up to do only one way. Now, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to wind a bobbin because I need to readjust that because I've played with that. So I'm going to overlap, and when I wind a bobbin on my bobbins, I wind about 10 winds on here to make sure that that thread is locked. I then take my snips and I go right to the axle and I snip the tail, and then I go ahead and I go, let me turn this back now. Let's go to the side. And for my bobbin winder, of course, it goes under and over, under and over. So as you're looking at it, it winds clockwise. I'm going to slide it on the peg. Now that's another thing, this peg. So this peg, you'll notice they all have a slit in them. I have mine adjusted so that my bobbin goes on there well, it's snug, but it's not painfully tight. If this peg is opened so that when you put your bobbin on there, you really have to force it and push the edges, you're going to warp your bobbins. You don't want to do that. You want it to be snug, but not so snug that you're having to push the sides of your bobbin. Let me start from there. We go. Okay, now I just want to get a little bit wound down there. So now what I want to do is let's turn it, and I want to see this side. We have this, and I'm going to go ahead and get that in a position where when I squeeze in, because I think this is important for you to see, I want you to see, let me back that up a little bit, that thread winding on that bobbin. Okay, do you see how it's going back and forth and back and forth? Everything looks nice and consistent. So that tells me that I have my adjustment here. This is in the proper position. Go in tight. Everything looks good. Okay, now I have it set to auto stop there. So one of the things that I see is that I need to make a little adjustment so that it fills up on this outer portion. It's not perfectly even. Now, what I used to do, of course, and what a lot of you I know do, because you do the same thing I do, I know what a lot of you do is you go ahead and you use your finger and kind of fill it up as you see fit. So you might hold that down and do the adjustment like that, right? But what you would do instead, now you know, is you wind a few bobbins and you make your adjustment using whatever knob system in and out of this peg, your tensioner, so that this winds perfectly consistent. And that is the process to adjust that perfectly. The next thing that, of course, I want to go back to for a second so I can clarify is if this is too tight, what you want to do is to get just a pair of pliers, and what you do is very gently just squeeze it together quickly, this peg, so that way you take some of the tightness out of that. That's why that slit is there. If it's too loose and your bobbin is just spinning there while it's trying to wind, then you simply take the screwdriver head, put it in that crevice right there, and you just gently pry it open. You got to find that perfect balance for that. And let me make sure that you can see that slit. There's your slit. Okay, now on most bobbin winders, the last thing we're going to touch on is that on most bobbin winders, when the bobbin is winding, you want it to, like I said, be between 3/4 and perfectly full. And that's pretty good right there. On this one, we have a line right here, and when the bobbin is on there, that tells us wherever that line is, let me put that on there. Wherever that line is how far the sensor is going to catch it when it gets that far. Now there's a knob here with the screw on it, and what happens is this. When I loosen that, this whole mechanism right here will slide forward or back. That way you will adjust where this knob or where the bobbin is based on where that line is, and that's going to tell you how far it fills. And again, most bobbin winders are going to have a mechanism similar to that. It might not be this exact one, but there you go. Okay, so let's do face on here. Okay, so hopefully that helps a little bit with how to adjust your bobbin so that you can have perfect tension, and that's one thing you don't have to worry about. You know, the one thing that I do want to add to that is the speed in which you wind your bobbins. I know this particular bobbin winder is 1 to 10, 10 being the fastest, and then of course 1 being the slowest it'll go. I typically go to about 5 or 6. I like that speed. I like the consistency. I find that when I take it all the way to 10, I find that my bobbins are not wound as lovely as I like them wound. And I find that if I go too slow, well, that's just a pain. So I find between 5 and 6 to be the perfect speed for me. And you would adjust yours, if your adjustments are a little bit different, to about halfway speed. I think that works really well. All right. So now, again, we have talked a bit about the bobbin winder itself, and once you get that adjusted and once you're aware of that, then let's talk about the bobbin tension and how I like to adjust it. I know there are some incredible tools out there. I don't think they're bad tools, at least one of them, which is one that I used to use years ago, and that was the TOA bobbin gauge. You know, they're anywhere from 75, boy, that's been years ago, so they're probably about 100 or maybe even a little over 100 at this point. I think it's a great tool. Now I'm talking about the checking the bobbin tension. The top tensioner of the TOA, I don't use that. I found that to be a complete waste of money. It didn't do well. I have no use for that. But the regular bobbin tester for the TOA, I think was nice. And then I found a way that would do it without having to have that TOA bobbin gauge. And it works exactly, I won't say it works exactly the same, but it does exactly the same thing. And I don't need the tool. And if I lose the tool, I don't have to panic and worry about how to do it. So I find that it works really well for me. Most of you know what that is. It is my drop test that I've always done. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Let me grab my bobbin we just wound. And again, what I want to do, let me put my pad on the table here. What I want to do is go over the best way and the fastest way I have found to make sure that my bobbin tension is perfect. Now, I'm pretty lucky because, like I said, 99.9% of the time I'm running 40 weight polyester. So once I adjust my bobbin case, I'm pretty good. It's very rare that I have to readjust it. Now, if I'm using like a sliver or a ribbon thread on top or something extremely fragile, then that's the time when I might just tweak it just a little bit less tight on my bobbin case. But that's pretty rare. So let me first talk about my regular daily quilting. My regular daily quilting, I do that normal test that I've always talked about, which is I set my bobbin case face up in my hand, and if we take the camera top down, I simply take this while it's laying in my hand. I don't go fast, I don't go slow, just a normal speed. I will take my bobbin and gently pull up like this. Now again, I don't do slow. It's a simple face on for a second so they see the speed, face on. I do this and I just take it up like this. I don't quickly and I don't painfully slow. I want to just do a nice pull up like that. And notice, now let's go back down. What happens with that bobbin case is that the second I do that, it pops up on its side, but it doesn't leave my hand. Now, if it didn't pop up on its side, what I would know is that my bobbin tension was too loose. And if it pops up on its side and leaves my hand, if we go face on, what happens is, and it was the old school way of doing it, where the bobbin case, they would have it come up with your hand, and then you'd have to do this, and it would slowly spider crawl down. I find that to be too tight, especially for some of these amazing threads we're running now. They're a little more, they're not more fragile, but what they are is, you know, back in the day, we used to run things like Gene Stitch and the Permacores and those things. That was a really strong, thick thread. We don't like to be as obtrusive with our quilting and our quilts now. And so we're running the 40 weights, the 60 weights, those types of threads. And we don't want that tension to be that tight that we would have to do a spider walk. It also, I find, when you run a tight tension in your bobbin, you also have to run a tight tension in your top because you've got to be able to pull that tight tension up into the quilt. That means you've got to tighten your top tension. And what happens is when you have a tight top and a tight bottom tension is that the sew holes that you create are spread further apart because that tension is pulling those stitches, right? That's how a stitch is created. And I don't like that look. That gives you holes when you hold a quilt up to the light. Sometimes people say, oh, I'm using the wrong size needle, and it's like, well, how tight are you running your tension? That's probably the problem, because I find typically you're not going to see stars when you hold a quilt up to the light unless you know, you are using something like a 21 or 20 and higher size needle for our long arm and mid arm machines. I typically run a size 18 needle and I never have any trouble at all. I just have no I see stars effect when I quilt. But of course I don't run my tension too tight. And to me, when you pull that bobbin case up, and if that bobbin case comes up in your hand, that's too tight. The other thing we want to remember is that there's a parameter. You know, it's like if I had a picture. Let me grab a piece of paper and let's go down here and let me talk a little bit about the next thing. So here what we have is we have just a graph, and I want to show you something. Up here, here is the line. We'll just call that tension. We're talking about our bobbin case tension now. At this point right here, what that is would be if I were to grab a hold of my thread and pull, the bobbin case would come up, and there's no way, even if I jiggled it, that thread would come down. So that's way, way too tight. Down here, this would be way, way too loose, where it just lays in your hand and the thread unspools when you try to pull it up and it won't stop. And when this is happening, what happens is you tend to get backlashing. even if your backlash spring in your bobbin case works well, this is so loose that you're going to get backlashing and rat's nest on the bottom of your quilt. So there is a sweet spot right in here. But that sweet spot is not just one spot. It would actually be somewhere in here would be good. You could use anywhere in here. So let me explain that. Let's face forward. So what this particular bobbin case is set for, which works well for that machine that I'm using, is when I do this and I pull that up, it pops right up and everything is good. But that is right at the beginning. Let's go down here. That is right at the beginning of where that bobbin case pops up. It's still, face forward, it's still pretty darn loose, but my machine likes to run at that particular tension. Now, some machines are going to like just a little bit more tension. So you might want to just take your screw and just tighten it just a little bit more tight. Now, doing that, there's still a nice big parameter here, back to the paper, where I can tighten it a bit and it's still not going to leave my hand, right? Up until about here. When you hit about here is when it's going to start to leave your hand a little bit and get way too tight. So I have some leeway right here. And every machine is a little bit different on how, face forward, where they like to be so that your tension is perfect. Again, some of them, when you take it to the top of that, like to here, not up here, but to the top here where it doesn't leave your hand, that's still a little too tight, and what happens is you can be breaking thread and having some issues. And so it likes to be a little bit lower. The machine that I'm running right now in there that we're going to be doing our test on is one of those machines. And so that's why we want to do a little bit of playing with tension. Everybody that has a machine should do this, what we're going to do in there a bit, for an hour, at least once a year, just to refamiliarize yourself with that. Now, there are a few things that are going to make a difference on testing tension when you get to a machine. So let me take a second and talk about the next thing that I think is extremely important. One of the things that I like to do is about once a year, I'll take all my scrap batting that I've collected, all my ends, which are these long strips that we cut off after we finish a quilt, of different batting. Now, I'm pretty exclusive about the battings that I use. The only battings that I use on my machines is Hobbs, Dream, and those quality battings. Now, in the Hobbs line, I'll use Poly Down, I'll use the 80/20, I'll use the wool. In the Dream line, I'll use the Dream Puff, I'll use the Dream Cotton, the 70/30s, those. And so I have a collection at the end of the year of these strips. So what I like to do is I like to load muslin on my machine, a nice size, approximately like a queen size top and back of muslin, pre-washed. You know, that's something else I always say, make sure when you load a quilt on your machine, if you want really good tension, the one thing that does have to be pre-washed is the backing. You want to get that sizing out of that backing because that will change your tension. The top, it doesn't matter, but the backing, it does matter. But let me go back. So I load a queen size muslin, back and top, and then what I do is I have those strips of batting, and I'll do a nice large meander as I put those in place and base those all the way across the quilt. And then I'll do a section of like the 80/20, and then after a throat space or two, I'll do my Poly Down, and then maybe the next section will be some wool that I put in there, and then the next section that I do, because I do a lot of double batting for my custom quilts, is I'll actually do my 80-20 and my wool. So whatever combinations of battings, if you're pretty exclusive to certain battings that you run in your studio, which I think is important. I don't want garbage batting. That's going to screw up your tension as well. There's a lot of batting out there that has air, just air. It looks like batting, but it's simply air in one section, and then there are areas of the batting where it's actually batting, but you can't tell the difference when you visually look at it. And what happens is, if that's the case and there's mostly air, that's going to change tension intermittently. That's why I don't like to go to the big box store and get their cheap off-the-roll battings, rather than the name brands like the Hobbs and the Dream. So I do these strips, and then what I do is I take that and I cut strips. I cut them about this wide, and then usually they're 90 inches long because I've loaded on a queen piece of muslin. And then what I do is I have those strips with those different battings. I then use my clamps when I want to test. So when I load a quilt that has 80-20 on it, if I want to set my tension quickly, I simply go off to the side of my quilt on my machine. I take that strip, I put it under my bar, clamp it, pull it tight to my belly bar, clamp it again, and then I do my testing of my tension on the same batting that I'm going to be using in the quilt that's next to it. So once I get that tension right on that little test piece, then when I know that when I go over to the quilt itself, it's going to be pretty good. Now some people will say, yeah, but it's different fabric. Yeah, but you're real close. I mean, you're right there. Sometimes we can split hairs and just make ourselves crazy. I have found that works perfect every time, to have these little test strips that you can test the tension on. And then I just unsnap it, take it off, I'm good to go, I've got my quilt loaded, and I know that I'm not going to have an issue. So that's another tip for you to do, especially my new people. Because one of the mistakes that people make is they'll test on something that's not the same batting as what's in the quilt, and then they're surprised when they go to the quilt and start quilting and they get bad tension. Because we want to remember, different battings have different thicknesses and densities, and so that's going to affect tension. Okay, so the next thing that I want to share is something that you all know. You all know my process with getting perfect tension immediately. Usually it only takes me about 30 seconds to a minute to get perfect tension. And so I know my bobbin tension is perfect because I've done the test. I pop it into my bobbin case, I pull my thread. You can go check out that tutorial, but very quickly. I pull my thread just to make sure that it feeds nice and smooth. You always know that if you get a tug, 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 what probably has happened is you have either a warped bobbin case or you have a warped bobbin. You can warp bobbins as well, and when you find those, you got to toss them in the trash. Bobbin cases we can save and use the bobbin case dewarper. Those babies are expensive. But you can throw out your warped bobbins. So I do that test, and then I go over to the quilt, as we will see in a minute, but I want to verbally walk you through it. And we know our bobbin tension's perfect. And so what I do is I pull up my bobbin thread, and then I pull up again about 8 inches of thread when that bobbin thread is up through the sandwich. And I want to feel smooth. I don't want to feel any tug or resistance whatsoever. And then, of course, I'm going to take some stitches at the machine, and just to reintroduce you, let's go down to the paper. When I test to get perfect bobbin at the machine, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do curved zigzags, just like this. Why is that important? If I just do loops and vines, what's happening is I'm not going to have any points. I want to have some points to look at when I'm figuring out the tension on my machine. And what am I figuring out here? I want to see pokies here. Now, face on. I don't want those pokies there when I'm quilting, but what I need to do, because I'm not a mind reader, is I need to know where that stitch is in the quilt sandwich. And so how do I do that quickly? My bobbin tension's perfect. I don't got to mess with that. I go to my top tension and I turn it one full turn. None of this click, click, click. Just one full turn. Do my curved zigzag. Let's go down to the paper again. And if I don't see pokies of bobbin thread here in the point, I know that it's not tight enough. Now let me redefine that. If there's no pokies here, I turn my top tension another half turn to a full turn until I see pokies right here in these points. Because that's where the pokies are going to show up first. That's where the bobbin thread coming up through the top are going to show up in these points. They're not going to show up in the smooth portion yet. They're going to show up in points because you go into a point and pop out. That's where thread's going to pull, and that's where you're going to start to see pokies. Do I want the pokies when I'm quilting? No. Back face forward, but I need to know where that thread is. So once I see pokies in these points, then what happens is now I know, oh, I've pulled my bobbin thread up to the top of the quilt sandwich. Now I know where it's at. Now I turn my top tension about a quarter to a half a turn until that little pokey just disappears under the surface of the quilt top. Get me? So you pulled it up to see where your tension is because you're not a mind reader. And one of the biggest problems for newbies and even some seasoned quilters is you'll do the looky-see. Oh, that looks good. You feel underneath. Oh, that feels good. Or you look underneath and it looks good. But if it's in, back to the paper, quilt backing, quilt top, quilt stitch, bobbin thread. If your bobbin thread is right here above the backing, here's the batting, and your top thread is here, whenever you remove a quilt from the frame, what will happen, our threads are going to sink. And so when you remove the quilt from the frame, you're going to get pokies coming out the back or even railroad tracking that wasn't there when you looked, because thread always sinks the minute you remove it from the frame. That's why you want to pull the thread up into your tips so that you can see a little pokey. I didn't say a loop, I said a pokey in each of the points, these points. Because now you know that you've pulled that bobbin thread up in there, and then you back off your tension so that when you're quilting, your stitch is just below the quilt top in the batting. Because now you know that when you remove the quilt from the frame and the thread is going to sink 30 to 50% down into the sandwich, that when it sinks, it's going to be right in the middle of the quilt sandwich. Quilt top, quilt back, and it's right in the middle, right? All right, face on. So that is how you do it. And as you see that, as you're going to see when we go into the machine, it is literally a pop the bobbin in. You already know it's good. Give it a pull to make sure you haven't flipped it around the finger. I take a single stitch. I grab on top. I pull. Yep, everything's good. I don't have a warp bobbin or bobbin case. And then I do my curve zigzag. Nope. Tighten. Curve zigzag. Oh, there's a little bobbin thread in the point. Okay. Now I back it off about a quarter to a half a turn, test again. Nope, no pokey. That means it's just under the surface. My tension's perfect. That takes maybe a minute. It doesn't have to be these horrible days of frustration. All right, so that's enough meat for this section. So let's go look at part 2 of this video when you're ready, and we're going to film that and show that next week, and that's going to show you at the machine me doing the testing with all of the different threads. As always, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and we will see you all down the road.